I wasn't supposed to find this place. I was on my way to visit Bulow Plantation Ruins when I spotted a historical marker on the side of the road. And because I apparently have no self-control when it comes to roadside history signs, I stopped. What I found was the story of Fort Butler, a Seminole War fort built along the St. Johns River in 1838, and then forgotten so completely that today there are no ruins, no walls, no reconstructed buildings. Just a marker, a name, and a story Florida almost let disappear. This is Fort Butler, and this is Forgotten Friday. When I first found this marker, I was actually trying to get to Bulow Plantation Ruins. Spoiler alert, I did not make it there that day. But I came home weirdly excited anyway, because Fort Butler fit perfectly into something I'd already been exploring: Florida's Seminole War history. The thing about Florida is that people think of it as beaches, springs, theme parks, and retirement traffic with strong opinions. But underneath all of that is a much older, much harder story. And Fort Butler was part of that story. It stood here during the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1842 and became the longest and most expensive of the Indian removal conflicts in United States history. The goal was simple and brutal: remove the Seminole people from Florida and force them west of the Mississippi. But the Seminoles did not go quietly. They used the swamps, hammocks, rivers, and dense Florida wilderness to resist one of the most powerful governments on the continent. And that meant the U.S. military needed control. Control of roads, control of settlements, and especially control of rivers. Fort Butler was built on the west bank of the St. Johns River near the old frontier settlement of Volusia. And that location mattered. The St. Johns wasn't just scenery, it was a highway. Before modern roads cut through Florida, rivers were how people moved supplies, messages, soldiers, and equipment through the interior. So during the Seminole Wars, controlling the St. Johns River meant controlling one of the most important arteries in this part of Florida. Fort Butler was not some grand stone fortress, though. It was a crude log stockade with barracks for the garrison. Temporary, practical, built fast. It was there to protect communication and movement along the river, and to help the U.S. military hold this contested frontier. For nearby settlers, the fort probably represented safety. For soldiers, it was duty, boredom, danger, heat, disease, and the constant possibility that the wilderness around them was watching back. But for the Seminole people, forts like this were not symbols of safety. They were symbols of invasion. Every fort, every road, every river crossing, every supply post was part of a much larger campaign to surround them, weaken them, capture them, and remove them. That's the part that makes these little roadside markers so heavy. Because they don't just mark where something stood. They mark where worlds collided. Here's what makes Fort Butler so strange. It was built in 1838, and it was abandoned in 1838. Its entire military life lasted only a few months. A few months. That's less Fortress of Destiny and more military pop-up shop with worse lodging. But that short lifespan actually tells us a lot more about the war itself. The Second Seminole War was not a neat, traditional war with clean battle lines. The Seminoles used mobility, knowledge of the land, and guerrilla tactics. They didn't need to attack a fort directly. They could move through the swamps, strike supply lines, and disappear into the landscape, and force the military to keep adapting. So Fort Butler may have mattered briefly, but the war moved. The strategy shifted, and the little log stockade on the St. John's was left behind. Then Florida did what Florida does best. It swallowed the evidence. Wood rotted, vegetation grew back. Rain, humidity, insects, and time worked together like a tiny historical demolition crew. No stone walls remained. No dramatic ruins stood for future travelers to photograph. No grand battlefield monument rose from the ground. Fort Butler simply faded back into the landscape. And this is why Fort Butler belongs on Forgotten Friday. Not because it was the biggest fort, not because a famous battle happened here, not because there are dramatic ruins left behind, but because it shows how much history disappears when there is nothing obvious left to see. Florida is full of places like this, places where something happened, places where people feared, fought, survived, resisted, waited, worked, or died. And then the buildings vanished. The land changed. The roads moved. The names slipped out of memory. And eventually the only thing left is a marker that most people drive past without noticing. But that doesn't mean the story is gone. It means the story needs someone to stop, someone to read the sign, someone to ask why it was there in the first place. And apparently someone who was supposed to be going somewhere else but got distracted by a historical marker. So yes, this episode exists because I failed successfully. In 1963, the Florida Board of Parks and Historic Memorials placed a marker here to remember Fort Butler. That marker says the fort was built in 1838 during the Seminole Wars. It describes it as a crude log stockade with barracks for the garrison, and it explains that the fort was designed to protect the St. Johns River, which served as an important artery of communication. That one sign is now the primary physical legacy of Fort Butler. No ruins, no preserved fort, no reconstructed barracks. Just a roadside marker holding the door open to a much larger story. And I think there's something powerful about that, because sometimes history doesn't survive as a building. Sometimes it survives as a sentence. Sometimes it survives because somebody cared enough to put up a sign. And sometimes it survives because a traveler pulled over and decided the forgotten thing was worth remembering. So why was Fort Butler forgotten? Because it was temporary. Because it was built from wood. Because it existed for only a few months. Because the Second Seminole War was so vast, so brutal, and so complicated that smaller places like this were easy to lose in the shadow of bigger names. And because Florida has a way of growing over its scars. But forgotten does not mean meaningless. Fort Butler reminds us that the story of Florida was not built only by beaches and resorts and postcard sunsets. It was also shaped by war, by removal, by resistance, by survival, by people fighting over what this land would become. And standing here today with nothing left but a marker, you realize something. History is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers from the side of the road. You just have to be willing to stop and listen. If you love forgotten Florida history, roadside markers, Seminole War sites, and the stories hiding in plain sight, make sure you subscribe and come back for more Forgotten Friday episodes. And let me know in the comments, have you ever accidentally found a historical site that sent you down a rabbit hole? Because clearly that is my cardio now. Thanks for exploring with me. I'll see you in the next one.